Hello and welcome. My name is Trey Calvin. I'm the Communications Director for the Center for Applied Linguistics. And today you have tuned in to Research to Policy, Critical Conversations in Language Education. Thanks for joining us today. We only have 30 minutes to get through our conversation. That's my reminder to speed this up. So I'd like to just go over some housekeeping items with the Zoom webinar that we're using today. We have attendees that are still coming in, but while you're acclimating yourself to the Zoom webinar, take a notice at the bar at the bottom of your screen. You'll see two icons that we'll be using today. One is the Q&A box, which you should use to submit your questions to our speakers. I would remind you that if you have a specific question to one of our speakers, their names are included in their little box. So make sure to call them out if you'd like a specific question addressed by one of them. The other box that you'll be using at the bottom is the chat feature. This is where we won't necessarily be monitoring questions there, but if you'd like to tell us where you're from, where are you calling in from today, please put that in the chat box and we'll keep up with you there. With that, my job here is done, and I'll turn it over to our Board of Director and Chair of this event, Ester de Jong. Ester.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, at least afternoon here on the Eastern Coast. Igone, I'm going to actually hand it over to you as my Center for Linguistics partner in this.
Great, thank you, Esther. Welcome, everyone. My name is Igone Arteagoitia, and I'm a research scientist at the Center for Applied Linguistics, or CAL para los amigos, right? Where I work primarily on dual language bilingual education projects. We are thrilled to have you all here with us today for one of our CAL critical conversations from research to policy, a series aimed at stakeholders and decision makers in education. Our hope is to inform and shape policy through dialogue with key experts. And in today's critical conversation, which is our fourth thus far, we take a closer look at the intersection between digital equity, the impact of the pandemic, and dual language bilingual education. In the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to explore just one core question and consider implications for policy. And the question is, why must we go beyond the tech when addressing digital equity and dual language bilingual education? So now I'm going to pass it on to Esther again, who will be introducing our three panelists. Not that Esther needs an introduction, but some of you may not know that in addition to her regular job as professor of ESOL and bilingual education at the University of Florida, she's also a member of the CAL Board of Trustees. Esther?
Thank you, Igone, and it's such a pleasure to be here, and welcome everybody to this particular webinar on dual language. Welcome to our three speakers: Sara Vogel, Postdoctoral Associate from New York University; Patrick Werito, Coordinator of Tribal Initiatives from Dual Language of New Mexico; and David Rogers, the Director for Dual Language Education of New Mexico. Without further ado, because if you didn't notice, we realized with three panelists in 20 minutes, we are on the clock. So I'm going to start with Patrick. Patrick, welcome. We're so pleased that you're here and really helping us think about the impact of the global pandemic, particularly on the indigenous community. We know that the pandemic has only amplified the inequity of resources for tribal communities. And it's really stressing the digital divide in the indigenous communities, underlying health issues. What has been in your experience and research, what has been the challenge of teaching online for the indigenous languages?
First of all, thank you, Esther, for having us today. What I'm going to be sharing with you is this discussion and conversation we've had with language teachers in and around New Mexico. And as you are well aware, there are other tribal communities throughout the United States. But for tribal communities or indigenous communities, they're at different stages in terms of community infrastructure, right? So some are located close to urban settings, urban communities, and others are located in rural areas. So that right there in itself, they're at different levels in terms of community infrastructure. So when schools were forced to close down because of the pandemic, some of these schools that were serving tribal communities did not even have the choice of going online learning because of this inequity in terms of infrastructure. So in other words, what we're talking about here is that some tribal communities did not even have high-speed Wi-Fi available to their community members. And pre-pandemic, some of the schools that were serving tribal communities didn't even have good, reliable Wi-Fi. And so when the pandemic hit, not all families and homes did not have access to Wi-Fi. And so this really, the only choice teachers had at that point was to send in learning packages home, right? And so when you're teaching oral language development, oral C for your indigenous language, this presents a challenge because, it's in some cases, tribal languages are not written or forbidden to be written. And so, this in itself presented some challenge for language learning for young learners. And in some cases, students, flat out just had no choice but to forfeit the whole school year. In other words, they're not even in school. So when you are when tribal communities are prohibited the teaching of the language through Wi-Fi, that also presents a challenge. So there were some communities that didn't allow their language to be taught, and so and of course, in some cases, when you have no written materials, that also presents a challenge. So that was just pretty much in a nutshell. But the bright side to that is that in some cases where language is written or being used, teachers notice some families were more engaged with their young learners in the home. So
yeah, it's a complex picture, and thank you for sharing that. And so kind of looking ahead, Patrick, as tribal communities face the reality of language shift and loss, language preservation and revitalization really becomes the push for elevating the vitality of the community language. What do you think is the role of the indigenous language in the community? And maybe more specifically, how can the indigenous language become a functioning language again?
well, with students entering school speaking only English, right?
Mm-hmm.
And schools are being heavy on literacy. Some indigenous language programs are quick to focus more on literacy. And so writing the language as a way to teach the students. And even though some tribes might not allow the language to be written. And so I think this really puts this idea of what is it, oracy, is it literacy, what's our focus? And so I think one of the things that that should be happening is supporting language programs to sort of a shift towards oral language development and not really focusing on literacy, because people acquire oral language first, right? And that's a precondition to literacy. And the concept of oral communication comprehension as the foundation for literacy, right? And so as more and more language programs focus on literacy, indigenous communities begin to ask the question, if schools are teaching our students to read and write our language, what is the role of the written language within the community? So in other words, let's say they're teaching the Dene language. And so then the question would be, how will that Dene language be used in the terms of literacy in the community when everything else is being done in English, right? And so then the other question is, how will then the written language be used? And so I think that's those questions that each community should be really thinking about. And of course, each community is different. So whatever answer option that's in front of them is really a local decision. And so I think one of the things that that we kind of have conversation around is this idea of a functional language, meaning that the language becomes the umbrella of the community, right? And then really making the language come alive again in every facet of the community, not just during ceremonies or not just during certain times, but in everyday conversation, in governments, in public safety, in health, and so on. And that really leads to that idea and of putting motivation in young learners to learn the language. Going back to the question of why are you teaching me my language? and that motivation for. And so when we say elevating the urgency, we're really talking about bringing the language alive again within the community. And there are those that say that the reality for some tribal community is that language losses is on the horizon. It's within 2 generations. You can actually see it happening now. And so I guess the challenge that's for a lot of tribal community is, do they wait until you have less than 10 speakers to really address language revitalization, or do you really do it now? So that's kind of like.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those insights, Patrick. I think that shows the dilemmas and the challenges. We're going to talking about shifting context. We're going to shift context, and we're going to go all the way up to New York, where Sarah's been doing some of her work with very different languages and very different contexts. And this is the beauty of this panel. Sarah, during the COVID pandemic, many dual language teachers have turned to digital tools to support their instruction, something we're sure will continue well past this moment in time. What values and assumptions are embedded in these tools? And are they always aligned with the values of dual language? Can you share some of your work?
Sure thing. So also thank you so much, Esther, for the question and for inviting me to be part of this. I'm glad to be here to sort of share some of my takes on digital tools and digital equity in dual language settings. And as the question sort of implies, the digital tools that we use in education are not neutral objects. Just as Patrick was talking about the challenges of incorporating these tools into Indigenous communities, when I think about incorporating them into dual language education in the settings where I've worked, I think about the ways that the tools themselves embed values. And really important to those working in dual language bilingual ed settings, they embed ideologies about language and bilingualism itself. That's important for us to recognize. So I have some slides. I always feel like on these webinars, it's nice to have some pictures to look at while someone's talking. So I'm going to just share some slides with some of these examples. So before the pandemic, I was doing my dissertation research in a 6th grade Spanish-English dual language bilingual classroom in New York City. And in this classroom, students had a range of experiences, but most of them had arrived from the Dominican Republic within the previous 4 years and were new to English. And so in this space, I was there to study how students engaged with their teachers' digital storytelling and computing units. But during one interview that I had with a focal student, one 6th grader, Andy is the pseudonym, brought up something else. They brought up the iReady software that the school asked them to use a couple times per week. And Andy remarked that they thought it was important that I study how bilingual kids learn to code and tell digital stories, because if not, students could think that computing is just iReady. And so in that space, for those of you who aren't familiar with iReady, it's a personalized learning software, which provides students with some leveled multiple choice and short answer ELA and math questions, especially targeted towards ELLs, English language learners. And you can see here, one of the guiding design principles of the tool is culturally responsive content. But when you look under the surface, the way the tool operationalized cultural responsiveness was actually pretty limited. The tool was guided by a monolingual language ideology that privileged English. And this philosophy was inconsistent with the values of the school's dual language program. So they have a math diagnostic that's available in Spanish, but all the other materials are in English, and this was by design. I found an interview with the vice president for English learning at the company that makes iReady in the publication EdSurge, and she says, translations aren't going to help students whose first language isn't that strong. The research shows kids coming into the US are the most educated and the least educated ever, and you need to figure out how to build English with little to anchor from. So these ideas are drawing on some older theories of bilingualism and even kind of verging on the idea of potentially semilingualism, which has been a disproven theory, can bake in some racist judgments about bilingual learners. I recommend critiques of these ideas by Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa. But the contrast, I want just to highlight here the contrast between the iReady designer's way of thinking about language and the way of thinking of the school's dual language program. The school was used to providing students with resources in Spanish, encouraging them to translanguage or use all of their language resources to make sense of new content. And this iReady classroom space was sort of instituted because of external pressures around state testing. And so it existed outside of other school initiatives and had values in tension with that dual language program. And students themselves had different values from the one that iReady had. This is just one more quote from the student who says that they wish that the tool could be provided in other languages because nunca es malo aprender tener dos o tres idiomas que más. It's never bad to have 2 or more languages. And one student actually called the tool racist. The student said, I think it's racist because it doesn't have 2 languages, it only have 1. So we can see here the values of the iReady software were not aligned with the dual language program or with students' values. So this is just one of those reasons to think about why it would be important to consider alignment between a program and tools and go beyond the tech.
Yeah. Wow, so that's such a powerful example of how those misalignments come. So in addition to kind of thinking about ideologies and how the program works, how do the values and assumptions of the digital tools actually shape students' interactions and experiences?
So a lot of students sort of enjoyed those gamified elements that came with iReady, but many students were quite frustrated in the research I was doing, and many of those frustrations I kind of concluded stem from the deficit thinking and assumptions and baked into the tool. So students were told that they were reading or doing math at a kindergarten or 1st grade level. It was pretty demoralizing. And then sometimes they would share the levels with each other in sort of competitive ways. Sometimes the system didn't provide written directions for tasks. And so students had to rely on the auditory input for the directions. And that was more challenging for some emergent bilinguals to process on its own. And then I also noticed, though, despite all these challenges, students developed these creative workaround strategies. And one of those was to sort of use the browser-based translation tool, which didn't always work because sometimes that was blocked in the school computer lab. But also I noticed students doing a lot of active translanguaging. So using all of their language resources to support themselves and their peers during this iReady time. So sometimes that happened in unsanctioned ways where students would whisper to each other. And if the teacher saw it, sometimes that would get shut down. But there were also sanctioned translanguaging moments where the teacher would say, you know, this is someone who's brand new to the United States and is new to English, and someone help me broker language so that we can figure this task out together, right? And there's also some use of the sort of default calculator app on the tool, which was one of the ones that was not blocked. So in a nutshell, the tool prompted some real frustration from students who felt disrespected by the tool or had to do extra work to comprehend and use it. And that creativity was not always legitimized. But I think it prompted these cogent critiques from students and these creative strategies, which educators would really do well to listen to.
Thank you for that little piece. It makes me think about what questions to ask as an educator. I think thinking through these digital tools that we always think sometimes as neutral, and they clearly are not. So the last part, because this is a research to policy webinar, we start thinking about policy. And I'm borrowing from Roberta Michelli, who did the webinar the other day. And her final question around policy was, if you had a magic wand, so David and Sarah, if you had a magic wand, what is it that you would change to address some of the challenges that we've been talking about? David.
Thank you, Esther. This has really been enlightening to be here with our panelists, listening to their perspectives on this. If I had, I'm thinking of our tribal language communities right now and how much I've learned from Patrick Werito and other native leaders that we have. If I had a magic wand, I want for all of us to have had the opportunity to go back to that day, 100 years, 150 years ago, when our native children were actually 100% in the care of their communities. That is, their language and cultural education was 100% driven by what their elders, what the multiple generations of the community had to offer, and everyone was a part of that. Because I believe that our educational system has taken that responsibility from the community, sometimes forcibly. And then I think as we've gone from generation to generation, it's just sort of become accepted, if you will, by our tribal language communities. That is the school that's responsible for the education. And the communities have given that up to some extent. So if I had a magic wand, I think, and let's say a recommendation to anyone who's an administrator or who in the school system or who's a policymaker out there, I would just like to remind them that if we want true language and cultural revitalization and preservation to occur, that any of the decisions we're making need to begin with deep conversations, or I should say, and our deep conversations by our Native leadership first and foremost. And we need to learn, we need to listen carefully, and we need to learn as to what they would have done in order to truly revitalize and to preserve their language and cultures. And we need to be totally respectful of that. We shouldn't take a step without them. It has to be Native leadership that makes that decision. So for what it's worth, that's my perspective for today to share.
That's a powerful one right there. Sara, shifting to you, based on your work, what would you wish for, or based on your work?
So similar to David's comments, our tools, think about, he said, our education has to reflect our communities and their goals. I think our tools, the tools that we use in education, those ed tech tools, should also reflect our community goals and values, and should also reflect the goals and values of our programs. We spend a long time creating these mission statements for our dual language education programs, just to then use tools that might frustrate those efforts. So I would also say that if I had a magic wand, all policymakers would carefully vet those computing tools. We know that tools are often purchased for entire districts in bulk fashion. Before sending out that order, policymakers should listen to their students and listen to their teachers and consider the alignment to those dual language program goals, and consider the classroom cultures that are fostered around and through these tools as well. Is it around competition, or is it around collaboration? And to really make space for bilingual students to trans language with and around tools, so that if your dual language program says we're using all of our language here to help us learn, that you don't bring in a tool that then says this is an English only space. So I think I would listen to our students and their critiques. They have very cogent critiques of these tools, and then purchase and make careful decisions about which tools to use based on that.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. We've done very well on time. Kudos to the panelists. Igone, I'm going to give it to you because I see there's lots of fascinating questions in our Q&A box. We won't be able to get to all of them, so I'll hear which one you have selected, and we'll have a moment to address.
Okay, thank you so much, Esther. Well, I want to say that if I had a magic wand, I would make all of our panelists policymakers. And I don't know if they want the job, but I think they would make great policymakers. Thank you all, to all of our panelists for such engaging conversations. And thank you for sharing about your research, Sara. Those students' quotes are so powerful. And thank you for bringing their voices to conversations like this one. We really need to do that more, and because after all, it's about their education, right? And somebody said in the chat, it's time to create our own digital tool. So I think you started something. I only found a couple of questions actually, so I'm going to throw. The first one is for Patrick, David, maybe. Either one of you who wants to answer this. The question is, what knowledge is lost with the tribal language if the language disappears? Would this be a motivator to maintain the language?
You want me to answer that, David? No.
Please,
I'll take a shot at that. I think when you have communities that have an oral history, right? Where history and the stories are all oral stories, right? They're not written down, but it's really passed on from generation to generation. And when the language starts to go, then I think a lot of those stories, emergent stories, and some of these, a lot of those stories are also interwoven with ceremonies and different. And so when you begin to lose the language, then you begin to lose, I think, not only the history, the oral history of it, but also the ceremonies, the traditional ways. Also, the thing I think is the norms, the community norms. For example, like in my tribe, we have clans of your mom and your dad and your paternal. So clans, really what it does is really keeps the society in check in terms of norms and values, right? In other words, who not to marry, who's related to you, and giving that community infrastructure, if you will. And I think when language starts to go away, then I think things like that will start to go away, and then it's no longer respectful. There's no that relationship piece. And then I think the other thing might be from a metalinguistic way of thinking about it, like in, let's say in English, you say prayer. In our language, we say sotezin. So when you break down that word, sotezin, so is like your tongue, right? The yin is holy, spiritual. So your prayer is very spiritual, and so be careful what you say and things like that. So a lot of those knowledge, there's very little things, not, very little bitty things will go away. And I think the last thing is what I would probably share with what an elder said to us is, if you don't speak the language, then you can't think in the net. So your perspectives are going to be this Western, this English perspective. And that what it truly means, when we say truly mean the indigenous perspective, what is that? And if you don't speak the language, then I think that would start to be changed, at least. Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Patrick. I mean, I don't know that I would call those little things. I think they are very important things. So thank you so much for sharing all that with us. The other question, and I think there may be a few more, but I haven't, this is the one that I have for you in the next couple minutes that we have. And this one has to do with assessments. There seems to be a lot of questions on assessments in this series. And it says, is there any progress in developing assessment opportunities in languages other than English? And I will add, including indigenous languages, and I will also add in multiple languages at the same time, right? To capture that translanguaging that Sara talked about. So I'm just going to throw that one out there for whoever wants to take it. Do we have a taker?
Well, I guess I'll speak to that one in the context of, I see another one who says, who demands that the companies begin to produce these equitable digital products? So I'll speak from I don't know as much about the assessments at the sort of state level assessments, but in thinking about products like iReady that aim to provide diagnostic or otherwise assessments, formative assessment to teachers about their students' language growth. And increasingly that's happening through the use of online tools. And this question of who demands it, I think that's sort of the answer. Like, it has to be demanded. Teachers and dual language program coordinators and principals that work in these settings, that understand how important it is for students to use all of their language resources in order to show what they know, have to be at the table in terms of designing the tools and implementing them and choosing them. So I think that there are tools out there, certainly, but they might not get as much attention. And it's important for us to demand those tools that will help us really understand what our students know and can do across their linguistic repertoire.
Great. Well, we only have 1 minute, so I think I'm just going to close it here. This has been great. It's been, amazing. I hope you feel the same way. I think from what I've been seeing in the chat, there are a lot of people who feel the same way. Thank you, everybody, for your participation in today's webinar series, and a special thank you to our panelists for your contributions to this critical conversation. We really appreciate you taking us beyond the tech, beyond literacy, beyond an Anglocentric view of language learning, and when addressing digital equity and dual language bilingual education. I put some resources in the chat, and as Trey said, you will get a recording of the session in about 24 hours or so. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Bye, everybody.
Care, everyone.